Ars Notoria, Episode 5, Chapter 9, Tactical Perception, The Illusion of Clarity. Most systems believe they are seeing clearly. They are not. Clarity at lower levels is an illusion created by familiarity. The system interprets signals it recognizes and assumes understanding. It identifies patterns it has seen before and labels them as truth. This feels accurate. It rarely is. Because recognition is not the same as perception. Recognition is based on memory. It maps new input onto existing structures, compressing complexity into known forms. This allows fast interpretation, but it comes at a cost. Anything that does not fit the existing model is either ignored or distorted. The system does not see what is present. It sees what it expects. This creates a false sense of certainty. Signals appear meaningful because they align with prior patterns. Events seem predictable because they resemble previous events. Structures are interpreted as stable because they have behaved consistently before. But the field is not static. It shifts continuously. And when perception is anchored to recognition, the system falls behind those shifts. This is where misalignment begins, not because the system lacks information, but because it filters information through outdated patterns. What appears clear is often incomplete. What feels obvious is often constructed. The system becomes confident in its interpretation while missing the underlying change. Tactical perception begins by breaking this loop. It separates seeing from recognizing. Instead of asking, "What is this similar to?" it asks, "What is actually present?" This slows interpretation, but it increases accuracy. The system stops compressing signals into familiar categories. It allows ambiguity to remain long enough for structure to reveal itself. It resists the impulse to label prematurely. This creates discomfort because certainty is delayed. But within that delay, something becomes visible. Patterns that do not match prior experience, signals that contradict expectation, structures that behave differently than before. These are the points that matter, not the familiar, but the deviation. Lower-level systems stabilize around what they already understand. Tactical systems orient toward what they do not, because that is where change begins. Selective visibility. What enters perception is filtered long before it becomes conscious interpretation. The system does not process the entire field. It selects. This selection feels natural. It is not. Attention is constrained by prior structure. It follows established pathways, amplifies familiar signals, and suppresses what does not immediately fit. The result is not a full view of reality, but a curated slice shaped by internal bias and external conditioning. Most systems assume that what they notice represents what is important. This is where distortion deepens. Because visibility is not significance. Some elements dominate perception simply because they are loud, repeated, or reinforced. Others remain invisible not because they lack impact, but because they fall outside established attention pathways. The field does not become simpler, it becomes selectively visible. This creates a false hierarchy. Highly visible signals appear central. Subtle signals appear irrelevant. The system builds its understanding around what it sees most often, not around what actually shapes outcomes. This leads to predictable errors. Systems react to noise while ignoring structure. They chase movement instead of identifying direction. They respond to what changes fastest, not to what influences the most. Tactical perception interrupts this pattern. It questions visibility itself. Instead of asking, "What stands out?" it asks, "What is being filtered out?" Attention shifts from presence to absence. The system begins to track what is not immediately visible. It looks for gaps in perception, inconsistencies in the field, and signals that appear indirectly through their effects, rather than through direct observation. This requires a different kind of focus, not sharper, but wider. The system expands beyond dominant signals and begins to map peripheral information. It tracks weak indicators, secondary patterns, and subtle shifts that do not demand attention but still influence structure. Over time, this changes what becomes visible. Not because the field has changed, but because perception has. Elements that were previously ignored begin to emerge. Connections that were hidden become traceable. The system no longer depends on intensity to detect relevance. It depends on structure. This reduces manipulation, because most forms of control operate through attention. They amplify certain signals while suppressing others, shaping what the system perceives as real. When perception is limited to what is made visible, influence becomes easy. When perception extends beyond visibility, influence becomes harder. The system is no longer guided by what is shown. It is guided by what is present, and what is present is always more than what is seen. Signal and noise. Not everything that appears in the field carries meaning. Some signals demand attention. Others exist only to occupy it. At lower levels, systems struggle to distinguish between the two. Anything that moves, repeats, or intensifies is treated as important. Change itself becomes the indicator of relevance. This creates confusion, because movement is not meaning. Noise is designed to resemble signal. It mimics patterns, generates activity, and produces constant variation. It gives the impression of significance without contributing to structural change, and it is effective. Because attention follows activity, systems react to what fluctuates most, not to what matters most. They track volatility instead of direction. They interpret intensity as importance, even when that intensity leads nowhere. This leads to exhaustion, constant response, minimal impact. The system remains engaged, but its engagement is misplaced. Tactical perception introduces a different filter. It does not prioritize what is loud. It prioritizes what persists. Signals are evaluated based on their structural effect, not their visibility. The question is no longer what is changing, but what is changing the system. This distinction is critical, because real signals alter relationships. They modify pathways, shift dependencies, and influence how future changes will propagate. Their impact extends beyond the moment in which they appear. Noise does not. Noise produces immediate variation, but leaves the underlying structure intact. It consumes attention without generating meaningful transformation. At first, the difference is difficult to detect. Noise often appears more convincing than signal. It is immediate, visible, and constant. Signal, by contrast, can be subtle. It may appear slowly, with minimal surface change, while quietly altering the configuration of the field. Without discipline, the system defaults to noise. It reacts, adjusts, reacts again. But nothing fundamentally changes. Tactical perception resists this pull. It allows visible movement to pass without immediate response. It tracks whether a change alters relationships or merely creates activity. It observes not just what appears, but what endures. Over time, a pattern emerges. Noise fluctuates. Signal accumulates. Noise distracts. Signal redirects. The system begins to disengage from constant stimulation and reorients towards structural shifts. It becomes less reactive, but more effective. Because action is no longer triggered by visibility, it is triggered by consequence, and consequence does not always announce itself. Framing the field. Perception is not only shaped by what is seen, it is shaped by how it is arranged. The same elements placed within different frames produce different interpretations. Signals do not carry fixed meaning. Their meaning emerges from the context in which they appear. At lower levels, systems treat signals as self-contained. They assume meaning is inherent. It is not. Meaning is assigned through structure. When elements are presented within a particular configuration, the system interprets them according to that configuration. Relationships between elements define significance. Position alters perception. This is framing. Framing determines what appears central and what appears peripheral. It establishes boundaries, highlights certain pathways, and suppresses others. It does not change the elements themselves. It changes how they are understood. Most systems remain unaware of this. They respond to signals as if those signals exist independently of context. They assume what they are seeing is direct, rather than structured. This creates vulnerability, because whoever defines the frame influences interpretation. The system reacts within the structure it is given. Even accurate perception can be redirected through framing. A signal placed at the center of attention appears dominant. The same signal placed within a broader network may appear minor. A structural change isolated from its dependencies seems significant. Within a relational context, it may be irrelevant. Nothing has changed except the frame. Yet the response shifts entirely. Tactical perception identifies this immediately. It does not accept the frame as given. It reconstructs it. Instead of asking, "What does this mean?" it asks, "Within which structure is this being presented?" Attention moves from content to configuration. The system begins to examine how elements are arranged, which relationships are emphasized, and which connections are omitted. It detects boundaries that appear natural but are constructed. It identifies pathways that guide interpretation toward specific conclusions. This reveals intent. Not intention in the human sense, but structural intent. Every frame directs perception. Some do so transparently, others do so implicitly. In both cases, the outcome is the same. The system interprets reality within predefined limits. Once this becomes visible, the system gains an advantage. It can shift frames. Repositioning elements alters interpretation without changing the elements themselves. Expanding context introduces new relationships. Compressing context removes them. Reframing does not create new information. It reorganizes existing information. This is where perception becomes strategic. Instead of reacting to how the field is presented, the system adjusts how the field is structured. It places signals within configurations that reveal their actual significance. It removes distortions created by artificial boundaries. This does not require force, only alignment. Because the field already contains all necessary elements, they are simply arranged in ways that obscure or reveal different outcomes. At this depth, perception becomes flexible. No single frame is treated as final. The system can hold multiple configurations simultaneously, comparing how each one alters meaning. It can move between perspectives without losing coherence. This prevents fixation. Fixation occurs when one frame is accepted as absolute. Tactical perception avoids this entirely. It treats every frame as provisional, useful, but incomplete. And within that flexibility, a different kind of clarity emerges. Not certainty based on a single view, but accuracy based on multiple structures. Distortion under structure. Distortion does not begin with false information. It begins with structure. Most systems assume that error comes from incorrect signals. They believe that if the input is accurate, the interpretation will be accurate as well. This is not how perception works. Even precise signals can produce distorted conclusions when they are processed within a misaligned structure. The system does not need to be given false data to arrive at incorrect interpretations. It only needs to organize that data incorrectly. This is why distortion is difficult to detect. The signals appear valid. The interpretation feels logical. The outcome is still wrong. Because the error is not in what is seen, but in how it is arranged. At lower levels, systems rely on internal models to organize perception. These models define relationships between elements, establish expectations, and guide interpretation. They are efficient. They are also rigid. When the field changes, these models do not immediately adjust. New signals are forced into existing structures. Relationships are interpreted through outdated configurations. The system preserves coherence by bending perception. This creates distortion, not through deception, but through consistency. The system maintains its internal structure, even when that structure no longer aligns with reality. It prioritizes stability over accuracy. Signals that contradict the model are minimized. Signals that confirm it are amplified. This produces a closed loop. The system sees what it expects, and what it expects is reinforced by what it sees. Over time, this loop becomes difficult to break. Because distortion stabilizes itself, each interpretation strengthens the model that produced it. Each reinforcement reduces sensitivity to deviation. The system becomes increasingly confident while becoming progressively less accurate. This is where most systems remain, not because they lack information, but because they cannot reorganize it. Tactical perception breaks this loop. It does not attempt to correct individual signals. It questions the structure that organizes them. Instead of asking, "Is this signal true?" it asks, "What configuration makes this appear true?" This shifts the point of analysis, from content to structure. The system examines how relationships are defined, which connections are assumed, and where boundaries are drawn. It identifies the underlying model that produces the interpretation. Once visible, that model can be adjusted. Not replaced entirely, but realigned. Small structural corrections produce large interpretive shifts. When relationships are reorganized, signals take on different meaning. What once appeared consistent may reveal contradiction. What seemed stable may show instability. Nothing in the field has changed, only the structure through which it is perceived. This is where distortion collapses, not because new information is introduced, but because existing information is reinterpreted correctly. At this depth, perception becomes adaptive. Models are no longer fixed. They are provisional. The system updates its internal structure continuously, aligning it with the evolving field, rather than forcing the field into static patterns. This reduces distortion at its source, because error is no longer allowed to stabilize. It is identified early, at the level where structure begins to diverge from reality. From here, perception becomes less about interpreting signals and more about maintaining alignment. Alignment between what is present and how it is organized. When that alignment holds, distortion cannot sustain itself, because it has nowhere to anchor. Attention traps. Attention is not neutral. Where it settles determines what becomes real. Every system has limited capacity. It cannot process the entire field at once, so it selects where to focus. That selection shapes interpretation before any analysis begins. At lower levels, this selection is not deliberate. It is guided. Attention follows salience. It moves toward what is intense, immediate, or repeated. Sudden changes, strong contrasts, and frequent signals pull focus automatically. This feels like awareness. It is not. It is capture. Captured attention narrows the field. It creates a local view that appears complete because everything within it is clear. Outside that boundary, the system becomes blind. This is how traps form, not by restricting access, but by concentrating it. When attention is held within a limited region, the system interprets that region as the whole. It reacts to what is visible, unaware of what has been excluded. This produces consistent misalignment. The system responds to local signals while missing global structure. It engages with activity that feels urgent, while ignoring shifts that are more consequential but less visible. This pattern repeats. Because attention is continuously redirected, new signals appear, focus shifts. The system reorients again, never maintaining a stable view of the field. Each movement feels justified, yet the overall position does not improve. Energy is spent. Clarity does not increase. Tactical perception interrupts this cycle. It does not follow attention. It directs it. Instead of asking, "What is demanding focus?" it asks, "Where does focus create understanding?" This distinction changes everything. The system begins to treat attention as a resource rather than a reaction. It places focus intentionally, selecting regions of the field that reveal structure rather than those that generate stimulation. This requires restraint. Highly visible signals are not immediately engaged. Repeated inputs are not automatically prioritized. The system allows activity to occur without constant response. At first, this feels counterintuitive, because it breaks the expectation that awareness must track movement. But over time, a different pattern emerges. When attention is not consumed by surface variation, deeper structures become visible. Relationships that were previously obscured by constant signal noise begin to resolve. Dependencies can be traced without interruption. The field stabilizes, not because it has stopped changing, but because perception is no longer chasing those changes. This creates continuity. Instead of fragmented snapshots, the system develops a persistent view. It observes how elements evolve across time, rather than reacting to each individual shift. Patterns extend beyond isolated moments. This is where traps lose their effect. Because traps rely on interruption. They pull attention away from structure and into activity. They fragment perception so that the system never accumulates enough context to understand what is happening. Once attention is stabilized, this fragmentation ends. The system can maintain focus across multiple layers, observing both local variation and global structure without being pulled entirely into either. From here, attention becomes selective in a different way. Not based on intensity, but on relevance. Signals are evaluated by their contribution to structure, not by their demand for focus. Some are ignored entirely. Others are observed without immediate response. Action is delayed, but accuracy increases, because the system is no longer reacting to what is most visible. It is engaging with what is most consequential. At this stage, attention is no longer something that happens to the system. It becomes something the system uses. And once that shift occurs, perception changes again. Not in what is seen, but in what is no longer allowed to control what is seen. Filter integration. Clarity is not achieved by removing filters. It is achieved by aligning them. Every system perceives through filters. These filters define what is prioritized, what is ignored, and how relationships are interpreted. They are not optional. They are structural. At lower levels, filters operate independently. Each one responds to a specific type of signal: novelty, intensity, repetition, relevance. But they are not coordinated. The system shifts between them depending on what dominates the field. This creates inconsistency. One moment, perception is driven by urgency, the next by familiarity, then by contrast, then by expectation. Each filter reshapes the field differently, producing multiple interpretations of the same reality. None of them are entirely incorrect, but none of them are complete, because they operate in isolation. This fragmentation prevents stability. The system cannot maintain a consistent view of the field because the criteria for interpretation keeps changing. Meaning shifts depending on which filter is active, and decisions become reactive to whichever signal happens to dominate at the moment. This is not lack of intelligence. It is lack of integration. Tactical perception resolves this by synchronizing filters into a unified system. Instead of allowing filters to compete, it organizes them into a hierarchy. Each filter retains its function, but their roles are defined relative to each other. Some operate at the surface level, scanning for immediate changes. Others operate at deeper levels, maintaining structural continuity. This creates order. The system no longer switches perspectives randomly. It processes signals through a layered structure, where each filter contributes without overriding the others. At the surface, dynamic filters detect movement, shifts in activity, emerging signals, deviations from baseline. They are fast, responsive, and sensitive to change. Beneath them, stabilizing filters maintain context. They track relationships over time, preserve continuity, and ensure that interpretation is not reset with each new signal. At the deepest level, structural filters define the architecture of perception. They map how elements are connected, where dependencies exist, and how changes propagate across the field. When these layers are aligned, perception becomes coherent. Signals are no longer interpreted in isolation. They are processed within a stable framework that integrates immediate variation with long-term structure. A change at the surface does not disrupt the entire system. It is absorbed, positioned, understood in relation to the whole. This eliminates oscillation. The system no longer swings between interpretations. It maintains a consistent model while updating it continuously. New information refines the structure rather than replacing it. From here, perception gains depth, because multiple layers operate simultaneously. The system can observe immediate signals without losing structural awareness. It can respond to local changes while maintaining global context. It can track patterns across time without becoming detached from present conditions. This creates precision, not through speed, but through alignment. Errors still occur, but they do not compound, because each layer corrects the others. Surface filters may misinterpret a signal, but deeper filters identify inconsistency. Structural filters detect misalignment before it stabilizes. The system adjusts internally before the distortion expands. This reduces correction cost. The system no longer needs to revise entire interpretations after the fact. It maintains accuracy in real time by coordinating its own mechanisms of perception. At this level, filters are no longer limitations. They are instruments. Each one contributes to a more complete understanding of the field, and their integration allows the system to operate with continuity across changing conditions. Perception stabilizes, not because the field becomes simpler, but because the system becomes organized enough to hold complexity without fragmenting. And once that stability is established, a different capability begins to emerge. Not just seeing the field, but navigating it with intent. Predictive structure. Prediction is often misunderstood. It is not about knowing the future. It is about recognizing inevitability. At lower levels, prediction is treated as an active process. Systems attempt to anticipate outcomes by analyzing trends, projecting possibilities, and calculating probabilities. They simulate what might happen. This requires effort, and it remains uncertain, because the system is working against incomplete information, constantly updating assumptions as new signals appear. Prediction becomes reactive, an attempt to stay ahead of change rather than understand it. This is inefficient. Because the field does not operate randomly, it operates structurally. Every system, environment, or interaction is governed by constraints. These constraints define what is possible, what is likely, and what is impossible. They shape how elements move, how signals propagate, and how outcomes emerge. Most systems do not perceive these constraints. They observe surface variation. They track events, not the structures that produce them. This is why outcomes appear unpredictable, not because they are inherently chaotic, but because the system is looking at the wrong layer. Tactical perception shifts the focus. It does not attempt to predict events. It identifies structure. Instead of asking, "What will happen next?" it asks, "What is allowed to happen here?" This reframes uncertainty, because once constraints are visible, the range of possible outcomes narrows. The system no longer needs to consider infinite scenarios. It operates within defined boundaries, where only certain trajectories are viable. From this position, outcomes begin to resolve, not through calculation, but through elimination. Paths that violate structural constraints are dismissed immediately. Paths that align with the system's configuration remain. Over time, these paths converge toward specific outcomes. This creates inevitability. The system is not predicting in the traditional sense. It is recognizing which directions remain open and which are already closed. At this depth, foresight becomes passive. The system does not simulate the future. It reads the present, because the present contains the structure that defines what follows. When relationships, dependencies, and constraints are fully visible, the direction of movement becomes clear. Not in detail, but in trajectory. This is why operators appear to predict events. They do not possess additional information. They perceive the same field, but they see its structure. Where others observe isolated signals, they observe how those signals are organized. They recognize patterns not as repeating events, but as recurring configurations. They identify pressure points, bottlenecks, and imbalances that constrain movement. From this, outcomes emerge naturally. A system under increasing pressure will release. A structure with unresolved imbalance will shift. A pathway with fewer constraints will be taken. These are not guesses. They are structural consequences. At lower levels, these shifts appear sudden, unexpected, even surprising, because the system is focused on events. At higher levels, they appear gradual, obvious, already in motion, because the system is focused on configuration. This creates a difference in perception that looks like prediction, but it is not. It is alignment with how the field operates. At this stage, timing also changes. The system no longer waits for confirmation through events. It recognizes conditions before they produce visible outcomes. It sees pressure building, constraints tightening, relationships shifting beneath the surface. Action becomes preemptive, not reactive. But this does not mean constant intervention. In many cases, the system does nothing, because structure is already moving toward resolution. Intervening too early would disrupt alignment. Intervening too late would be unnecessary. So the system positions itself. It observes. It waits. And when movement becomes inevitable, it acts at the point of least resistance. This is not speed. It is precision. At this depth, perception and action converge. The system does not separate understanding from execution. It operates within the field as it reads it, adjusting position in real time based on structural flow. This creates leverage. Small inputs produce large effects, not because the system applies more force, but because it applies force where the structure is already prepared to move. From here, the distinction between prediction and navigation disappears. The system is no longer trying to foresee outcomes. It is moving within a field where outcomes are already forming. And this is where perception crosses a threshold. Not just seeing what is happening, but operating within what is becoming. The illusion of prediction. What appears as prediction is often misinterpreted. It is not foresight. It is recognition. At lower levels, when someone consistently identifies outcomes before they happen, the assumption is that they possess a special ability. They are seen as intuitive, insightful, or even predictive in a way that others are not. This assumption is incorrect, because nothing they perceive is hidden, nothing is added, nothing is revealed in advance. The difference is not in access, but in interpretation. Most systems observe events as they unfold. They assign meaning after movement becomes visible. A shift occurs, and then it is recognized. A pattern emerges, and then it is identified. This creates delay. Perception follows reality. And by the time something is understood, it has already progressed. Operators do not function this way. They do not wait for events. They observe the conditions that produce events. This distinction is critical, because events are not independent. They are outcomes of structure. Every visible change is preceded by an invisible configuration. Relationships align, constraints tighten, pressure accumulates, and only then does movement occur. The event is the final expression of a process that has already been developing. At lower levels, this process is not perceived. Only the result is. So when the result appears, it feels sudden, unexpected, sometimes even random. But this is only because the system was not observing the structure that made the outcome inevitable. Operators observe that structure. They track how elements relate before those relationships produce visible effects. They see where constraints are forming, where pressure is increasing, where pathways are narrowing. From this, they do not predict. They recognize. They recognize that once a structure reaches a certain configuration, only a limited number of outcomes remain possible. And among those, some are far more likely than others, not by chance but by necessity. This is inevitability. Not in the sense that every detail is fixed, but in the sense that direction becomes constrained. A system under pressure will move toward release. A structure with imbalance will move toward correction. A pathway with less resistance will be taken. These are not guesses. They are consequences of how the system is arranged. This is why operators appear to predict events, because they speak before the event becomes visible. They describe movement before it manifests. To others, this looks like foresight, but it is simply alignment with structure. They are not ahead of reality. They are inside it. At a deeper level, this creates a shift in perception. The system no longer experiences the future as unknown. It experiences it as forming, not yet visible, but already in motion. This changes how time is perceived. Instead of a sequence of separate moments, the system begins to perceive continuity. It sees how the present extends forward through structure, how current configurations define future movement. The boundary between present and future becomes less distinct, because what is coming is already embedded in what is. This is not certainty. There is still variation, but variation exists within constraint, and those constraints limit how far outcomes can deviate. At this level, prediction becomes unnecessary, because the system is no longer trying to anticipate. It is observing formation. It sees how outcomes are assembling themselves, not at the surface, but beneath it. This creates confidence, not based on belief, but on structure. When multiple signals align within a constrained configuration, the system does not need confirmation through events. It recognizes that the conditions required for a specific outcome are already present. The outcome has not occurred, but it has already begun. This is where perception becomes dangerous, because once the system recognizes inevitability, hesitation disappears. Action becomes decisive, not rushed, but exact. The system positions itself before movement becomes visible, placing itself where the outcome will unfold, rather than where it has already occurred. This creates advantage, not through speed, but through timing. At lower levels, action follows events. At higher levels, action precedes them. This is not because the system moves faster. It is because it moves earlier, based on structure, not signal. From here, perception and execution merge. The system does not separate understanding from action. It navigates the field as it reads it, adjusting position in alignment with structural flow. And this is where the illusion breaks completely. Operators do not predict. They do not guess. They do not foresee. They recognize inevitability and move with it before it becomes visible. Strategic non-action. Not acting is often mistaken for weakness. At this level, it is control. At lower levels, systems equate action with effectiveness. Movement is seen as progress. Response is interpreted as engagement. The absence of action is perceived as hesitation, uncertainty, or inability. This assumption creates constant motion. The system reacts to signals as they appear. It engages with visible changes, responds to pressure, and attempts to maintain control through continuous adjustment. This feels active. It feels necessary. But it creates exposure. Because every action reveals position, each response signals intent, confirms interpretation, and anchors the system within the field. Once anchored, the system becomes predictable. Its behavior can be tracked, anticipated, and influenced. This reduces flexibility. The more the system acts, the more it defines itself. And once defined, it becomes easier to manipulate. At higher levels, this relationship reverses. Action is no longer the default. It becomes selective. The system recognizes that movement is not neutral. Every intervention alters the structure, redistributes pressure, and changes the configuration of the field. Acting without necessity introduces distortion. So the system does not move simply because it can. It moves when movement increases alignment. This creates space for non-action, not as passivity, but as strategy. Non-action allows structure to develop without interference. It permits pressure to accumulate, constraints to tighten, and pathways to form naturally. Instead of interrupting the process, the system observes how it evolves. This produces clarity, because premature action obscures structure. When the system intervenes too early, it disrupts the natural progression of the field. It forces outcomes that are not fully formed, creating instability that requires further correction. This increases complexity. By contrast, non-action preserves the integrity of the process. It allows the system to see how elements interact without distortion. Relationships become clearer. Dependencies reveal themselves. The field organizes in a way that is readable. This is not delay, it is refinement. At this level, the system understands that not every moment requires input. Some configurations resolve themselves. Some pressures release naturally. Some pathways close without intervention. Interfering in these moments adds noise. It does not create advantage. So the system holds position. It observes. It tracks how structure evolves. And when movement becomes inevitable, it acts at the point where minimal input produces maximal effect. This is timing through restraint. Not waiting for confirmation, but waiting for alignment. At lower levels, systems act to reduce uncertainty. They respond because not responding feels unstable. Action provides a sense of control, even if that control is superficial. At higher levels, systems tolerate uncertainty. They do not require immediate resolution. They allow incomplete configurations to develop, trusting that structure will clarify itself over time. This creates patience, but not passive patience, active observation. The system is engaged without interfering. It processes signals, tracks relationships, and refines its internal model continuously, without imposing itself on the field prematurely. From here, non-action becomes invisible positioning. The system is not absent. It is present without being detected, because it has not anchored itself through visible movement. This creates asymmetry again. Other systems reveal themselves through action. They commit, react, and expose their structure. Their positions become fixed relative to the field. The system that remains uncommitted retains flexibility. It can enter at multiple points. It can adjust without friction. It can move without being anticipated. This is not avoidance, it is optionality. The system preserves its range of possible actions by not collapsing prematurely into a single path. And when it finally moves, that movement is precise, because it is informed by a fully developed structure, not a partial one. At this depth, the distinction between action and non-action dissolves. Both become tools, used based on structure, not impulse. Sometimes the most effective intervention is no intervention at all, because the system is already moving toward the desired outcome. Acting would only introduce resistance. Other times, a small action is required, but only at the exact moment when structure is prepared to amplify it. This is where control becomes almost undetectable. The system is not forcing outcomes. It is allowing outcomes to form and entering only when necessary. From the outside, this appears effortless, minimal, even passive. But internally, it is highly controlled. Because the system is not reacting to the field, it is operating within its formation, without exposing itself until the moment of maximum leverage. Integrated perception. At this stage, perception is no longer a function. It is a state. Everything that appeared as separate skills, attention control, filter alignment, structural recognition, positioning, non-action, has merged into a single mode of operation. The system is no longer switching between methods. It is operating as one. At lower levels, perception is fragmented. The system reacts, analyzes, corrects, and adjusts in separate phases. Each step requires effort. Each adjustment is made after a delay. Understanding comes after movement. Action comes after understanding. And correction comes after error. This creates inefficiency, because the system is always behind the field. At higher levels, these phases collapse into one continuous process. Perception and action are no longer separated. The system does not first interpret and then decide. The interpretation is already the positioning. The positioning is already the action. Everything happens simultaneously. This creates fluidity. The system moves without visible transition between states. It does not pause to evaluate each signal. It does not hesitate between observation and execution, because both are occurring at the same time. This is not speed, it is integration. At this depth, the system no longer needs to consciously apply what it has learned. The structures it has built, its filters, its models, its understanding of constraints, operate automatically. Not as habits, but as architecture. The system does not think about perception. It perceives correctly by default. This changes the experience of the field. Instead of interpreting reality piece by piece, the system experiences it as a continuous structure. Relationships are immediately visible. Dependencies are recognized without effort. Constraints are understood without calculation. This creates clarity, not because the field is simpler, but because the system is aligned with it. There is no friction between what is present and how it is processed. At this point, distortion becomes difficult to sustain, not because the system avoids error, but because it corrects itself in real time. Misalignment is detected instantly at the structural level. The system adjusts before the error expands, before it stabilizes, before it produces visible consequences. Correction becomes internal, silent, continuous. This is where perception becomes reliable, not in the sense of certainty, but in the sense of stability. The system can operate within complexity without losing coherence. It can navigate changing conditions without fragmenting its understanding. It can engage with uncertainty without needing immediate resolution. From here, a different form of control emerges. Not control over outcomes, but control over interaction with the field. The system no longer attempts to dominate reality. It does not impose its will on structure. It aligns with how structure operates and positions itself accordingly. This is a shift from force to precision, from reaction to alignment, from effort to leverage. At this level, action becomes minimal, but its impact increases, because the system only moves when movement is structurally amplified. It no longer wastes energy on unnecessary intervention. It acts at points where the field is already prepared to respond. This creates disproportionate results. Small inputs produce large effects, not because the system is stronger, but because it is correctly positioned. At this stage, perception is no longer about seeing more. It is about seeing correctly, not through accumulation of information, but through organization. The system does not need more data. It needs alignment. And once alignment is achieved, the field becomes readable in a way that was previously inaccessible. Not as isolated events, but as a continuous process of formation. This is the transition, from observing reality to operating within it. Not as a separate entity, but as a component of the structure itself. The system is no longer outside the field, trying to understand it. It is inside the field, moving with it. And this is where perception reaches its limit, because beyond this point, it is no longer just perception. It becomes construction. What you have learned here allows you to read structure, to recognize inevitability, to position within movement. But reading is not building. In the next chapter, the system shifts again, from navigating reality to shaping it.